Hello, everyone. We are live.
Hello.
The
Hello.
uh,
Hello.
the welcome to the different
Hello.
faces of Dungeon Core panel. We're getting a little late start.
Oh, we're not live quite yet.
Oh, it
There's a
says live.
delay. She'll let us know in a moment.
Gotcha.
Oh, you're finally awake. You headed to the border.
Okay, now we're live.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the different faces of Dungeon Core panel. I am your host, Bill Powell. I've got an esteemed group of Dungeon Core authors. We've got dinosaurs, slimes, spaceships, worlds, everything for you here. Overcoming some tech issues, but I'm going to go around the panel, have everyone introduce themselves, and we'll get started. Jonathan, you're up.
I'm Jonathan Brooks, and I started writing back in 2017. And to date, I now have 46 published books. So lots of different kinds, 12 different series. 9 of them are complete. I wrote Bio Dungeon with Jeffrey Falcon Loeb down there. So we've got a lot of Dungeon Core on this panel here.
Alex.
So I'm Alex Weisman. I started writing in general in about 2017 when I started publishing. I've been writing for most of my life before that. Didn't really start writing LitRPG until about 2020, and since then I've written a lot. Published a total of 14 books, and working on getting book 15 out soon. And yeah, I'm excited. Like I've fallen in with Dungeon Core, and I've been writing it. I love writing in it.
Awesome. Jeffrey.
Hey guys, I'm Jeffrey Falcon Loeb. Uh, I published my I wrote my first book for NaNoWriMo in 2015, and I published it the following year, 2016. I like to call myself the youngest of the oldest when it comes to the OG lit RPG people, because that word didn't exist before the end of that year. And I've published. I get the numbers confused sometimes because of the novellas and such, but I believe I've published 18 books at this point in time, with two more in the works right now. Also making the slime video game and a new secret project in the work. Well, open secret project in the works for YouTube, and I really enjoy the dungeon and all that fun stuff.
Awesome. Dean.
All right, I'm Dean Henniger. I've been writing since 2018. Started with LitRPG and quickly found Dungeon Core, and I've written the Dungeon Core and Space Derelict series, the War Core series, which is a kind of a blend of real-time strategy and Dungeon Core, and then Cat Core, which is elderly cat ladies making a dungeon full of house cats.
That one's my favorite from you.
Cool.
Awesome. So, obviously, this is the Dungeon Core panel. You've all have a ton of experience in this. I guess the first question I've got for you before the Facebook questions start rolling in is, how far can we push Dungeon Core? We've got cats, we've got holidays, we've got slimes, we've got dinosaurs and factories. How far are we pushing this? Where can it go from here?
Well, do you mind if I start, Alex?
Go
ahead.
for it.
So there's a lot of different ways to push it. I think Jonathan, out of us four, has pushed the most, just because he has all kind of series all over the place. He's got casinos and horror, and he did bio with me. But so the two that I'm writing right now, one of them is Dungeons and Recipes, Hungry Dungeon. So that is one way of doing it, and the other one is Dungeons and Economics. So it's the same kind of way I wrote Bio Dungeon with John, but the glossary will be economic terms instead of biology terms. And then I keep a running list of just dungeon ideas. So, for instance, a whole story where the dungeon is your own mind, like you're trapped in your own head, kind of a story. Uh, which I haven't written because I just can't think of a good ending because nobody likes it was all a dream kind of an ending. But if I ever think of it, I'll do that. And then you could also write a dungeon is essentially a type of location where a person is faced with danger, monsters, and possible treasure. So you could put that in any context with a room or a mental burden of some kind, and I think you could really take that in any direction.
Yeah, completely agreed. Like, I really think the sky's the limit with with a genre that's so new, and I love that. It feels like dungeon core as a genre is just really getting started, even more so than other subgenres, and so it's really exciting to kind of see the potential there. And I'm having a lot of fun with like I'm trying to, as much as possible, play with the formula, like keeping it true to being a dungeon core, but trying to find new ways to spin on it. Like the one I'm working on right now, Yaga Core, the dungeon that walks like a man. It was inspired by Baba Yaga's hut, which has walks on a chicken leg. I'm like, that could be a dungeon. And that's been what I've been working on right now. And it's a lot of fun, just the endless potential in this genre because there's so few well-established tropes of the genre besides a few like maybe a handful, but other than that, it's really like completely flexible what you can do here, and I love that creativity available.
And I like whether we're expanding beyond the hole in the ground dungeon. We started out there, and now we've expanded beyond those horizons to now walking dungeons, space dungeons. It's pretty awesome. Um,
Yeah, I was gonna say, pretty much anything can be a dungeon. So you can't. It doesn't just have to be a hole in the ground, like you were saying. So like what we did, we had a dungeon inside of a body. You've got dungeons in space. You've got dungeons just about anywhere. You got sci-fi dungeons. You've got fantasy dungeons. So you can pretty much take any kind of idea and run with it to make it some sort of dungeon core. You may just have to work with it a little bit to get it to fit, but any kind of idea that you have for a story, you could theoretically make it into a dungeon core story.
Yeah, like that chair you're sitting in, Jonathan.
Yes,
It's calling for you to never leave, huh?
pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think he ever gets out of it. Do you, Jonathan?
No, I'm in here pretty much all day. I could sleep in here too, but
I,
I have a bed.
I wouldn't leave if I were you. That looks very comfortable.
It's
Yeah.
very comfortable.
Yeah, I really don't think there's a lot of, I don't think we've tapped all the possible dungeons that are out there, and I hope the genre doesn't get locked into a mold of it's got to be a hole in the ground, it's got to be a crystal core, and that people because it seems like people tend to enjoy the a little bit more out there books too,
Mhm.
and they're a lot of fun to write, as you know.
And I actually wanted to add to that too. One thing that I do worry about is you'll see like if anyone tries to like a lot the dungeons so far have mostly been sorted by creature type. Like you mentioned, you got slimes, cats, dinosaurs, constructs. There's a lot of that happening, and I'm worried that I don't want us as authors or any author to feel like we're trying to stay like I write dinosaurs, therefore no one else can. Like we don't, I don't want that to be a thing because there's so much that can be done differently with all of that.
Right.
That's true.
It's funny you say that, and then also with Dean bringing up the tropes, because I honestly view myself as like the first dungeon core author. I wouldn't call myself the father because that kind of ideas existed, especially in Japan and other things, but not like the dungeon itself. Usually, there's a dungeon master, and all of these tropes are things that I put in, and I think to myself, have I lived long enough to become the trope? But I really appreciate when people run with new ideas, like the cat core you wrote, Dean. I was like, that's such a great idea. And
Thanks.
then Jonathan had the whole gambling thing with his what was it, Fortuna or Gam? There's so many I get my names
Yeah, it was
confused.
like the Dungeon of Chance,
There,
Mhm.
thank you.
probabilities and stuff.
Right. And so I really like it because then that means it's not a trope kind of genre. It is a genre with a few requirements, but you can take it in any direction. I mean, the corporate one I just wrote with Steven is a sci-fi with the more lit RPG elements than I usually do it, but still is a dungeon core because the station is controlling their lives.
We've got a quick question from Facebook. So the question is, they'd love to hear of your experiences with Dungeon Core anthologies. Have any of you been involved in anthologies? What do you think of them?
Yeah, I published them.
Yeah.
Uh, so the Dungeon Core anthologies I've done it to this date 5, and then the 6th one is open for submissions right now. And I basically do it to allow established authors to sort of have free advertisement. It's not great advertisement, but it's free. And then mainly for new people who want to write in the genre to get some free editing on a chapter's worth or a short story's worth of words so that they can take that and run with it and maybe be inspired or encouraged enough to make their own thing. You got that question from Ellen. She's the editor for that. So she has been a blessing for me and Jonathan, and I don't know who else she works with now, but she works with more authors these days as an editor.
Anyone else work with anthologies? Thoughts?
I've contributed to what Jeffrey's published, but I don't do any myself.
Yeah. So we talked a bit about how far we can go. We've talked about the tropes and what's going on in the growing world of Dungeon Core. So let's talk about writing a core versus writing a lit RPG. How does that differ? Obviously we're out of the dungeon now. We're not self-contained, but in the early days we were self-contained. What is that like writing for generally a stationary character versus in their own little world versus a typical lit RPG?
So I actually give a lot of thought while planning things out because it's one of the biggest challenges of the genre is managing the fact that your protagonist is inherently going to be stationary, and also your protagonist is going to be killing people who normally would be the heroes of another story, and those are two tricky things to overcome without it not being dungeon core anymore. And one thing that I found is remembering that these dungeons, like one thing I like to think about is these dungeons would, in their own worlds, be valuable resources. So important things happening near the dungeon really isn't out of the question. It would make sense because the same reasons important things happened near rivers historically or in coves because they were natural gathering points. And since, like in many worlds, the the only place for adventurers to level up, or at least the best way for that to happen, it makes sense then. Like the dungeon town is a trope, but also makes sense and it would happen naturally. And that I think makes it easier to keep the action localized, while the dungeon can interact with that however much they want or as little as they want, being reluctantly dragged into it or being well, since that was happening nearby me, it's now my responsibility. And I like that ability to have that dichotomy going on.
So I'm actually going to also relate this to a question. What started the whole dungeon fairy trope and why was it needed? So that was because of one of the challenges of writing a dungeon core, in that one single person's perspective that never moves is kind of boring. The original thing that was really stymieing dungeon core was issues of pacing and issues of keeping the audience's attention or interest, I would say. That's a cute dog. So, for instance, if the book was just going to be a monologue the whole way through, then eventually it would get boring in a way, because you had to change perspectives, or you needed to bring in another individual just to add a different perspective, different view, different flavor of the words, in a sense. So I created the Dungeon Pixies in the Slime Dungeon series to sort of serve as that foil, that sort of counter of, I know I'm your teacher, but you're the actual one doing things. Then I also added the adventurer perspective, just because it's healthy to have not only perspective of, like the dungeon master, because that's literally what a dungeon core book is, but also the players, right, the adventurers within your little maze of chaos, death, and treasure. uh, of course, the idea of a partner isn't always necessary, but then you're essentially writing from some thing, right, with a god complex, because literally they're god within their own domains, and you can do it, but then the pacing issue is a real concern, because you're already OP. Where you go from there? Uh, I've read a couple of good ones, like the dungeon. It's not the dungeon, but like the god characters watches like a race of primitives, or something along the lines of watching them evolve over time and interfering a little bit to help them continue. But it's really hard to do, because it's not an action intensive kind of a genre to write. It's a very passive slice of life almost kind of a thing. And that doesn't work in an adventure story per se, I think.
Yeah, and I think that it can be a little bit. At first, it seems almost limiting, where I only have this main character that's the core, and who do I add in here? How much interaction do I give them with the adventurers? Because it seems like some readers really enjoy that. Other ones just want to see the dungeon in every chapter. So it's a little bit of a balance, but I also enjoy the challenge. I love trying to create this world and get a little bit more in depth with the main character and their pixie, or in Cat Core's case, the kitten, whoever their assistant is.
I just want to piggyback on everything that was pretty much just said. It's definitely, when you're writing or even planning out a dungeon core compared to just a normal lit RPG, you really have to think about a lot of different elements. So you really have to think about the origins of a dungeon. Why is this dungeon even here? Um, and and other things that, like lit RPG stories, you may not have to think about. Like you can make some world building for lit RPGs, but you may not necessarily get those nitty gritty details of why a dungeon exists in the first place. I think that's where I start when I do a new story, new series. Is why is this dungeon here? How does it interact with the world, and how do other people interact with it? But I agree with all the other things that were mentioned as well, just the difficulties and differences.
And I kind of want to piggyback off that, because we brought up the dungeon fairy and all that. And one thing also that I added in my books was the concept of servitors, which are basically dungeon mobs that are also free willed, that often have kind of a childlike relationship with the dungeon, or the dungeon has a paternal role towards them. Because one thing I noticed when trying to write my first attempt at Dinosaur Dungeon, which did not make it anywhere, did not go well, was that the dungeon and fairy relationship could easily turn almost toxic, just because the dungeon is completely dependent on the fairy for contact with the outside world, and that can easily go very poorly. So I wanted to give the dungeon more ways to connect with other people without needing to just rely on adventurers who might not trust the dungeon because the dungeon is trying to kill them.
So another Facebook question came in here. Why do you think a lot of Dungeon Core books are going down the path of protecting, wanting a certain team of adventurers to live and thrive?
Because it drives the plot.
Yeah.
I would say. It's we are writing from the dungeon's perspective, but at the end of the day, we are humans, and more importantly, our readers are humans. So there's a limit to how let's say Eldritch. There's a limit to how non-human a perspective we can give before it confuses or disinterests the reader. Now, giving the adventurer perspective or giving the dungeon feeling towards some adventurers, it creates some relatability, I feel, that really allows the reader to sort of hone in and focus on something that they can more easily recognize and relate to. Plus, you can do all sorts of fun drama with it as well. Alex talked about the trope of the dungeon town, cop popping up outside the dungeon. That's the same kind of idea. It goes all the way back to pacing, right? It's not too hard. It's very hard just to keep a singular dungeon only focus.
Yeah, and I agree with everything Jeffrey said there. And also, I think another reason that that's a focus is what we were talking about with the Wisps, the limited cast, limited people a dungeon can interact with. By having the adventuring party for the dungeon to interact with and protect, you've expanded the people who interact with the dungeon from one person, the Wisp, to usually 5 more people. And that gives you a lot more options. It also helps. I mean, at the end of the day, a dungeon core is a creature that is probably in some way going to be involved in murdering a lot of people in creative ways. And having some people that they like and relate to makes them easier for, like Jeff was saying, make them easier to relate to, because it's like, okay, well, I can understand wanting to protect my friends and I don't like everyone else, as opposed to I want to eat everyone, which is not exactly, hopefully not too many readers can relate to that one.
Yeah, I think it's about a challenge too, because when you just have a dungeon core that just kills everybody, there's no challenge. There may be some hard parties that come through, but if you give them a challenge to actually connect with a certain party of adventurers or a certain race, it gives them a bigger goal, a larger goal, instead of just I need to kill everybody, and so that they can do something different. So it kind of expands the story and kind of goes out from the dungeon, not just what happens inside.
So I've got one for you that's a little offbeat, but you have been sucked into a dungeon core in one of your own books. Which dungeon core are you getting sucked into, and what's your first mobs?
Well, it's not going to be Bio Dungeon.
I'll start us off. I think probably for me it would be Derelict. It'd be nice to be a starship, and I think my first mobs would. Do we have to start off with low-powered ones, or can we just pick something good?
No, just pick something good. What's your theme? What's your dungeon theme?
Cyborgs. So you take whatever you killed in the dungeon, add some tech to it, and there's your defender. So whatever attacks you ends up making you stronger.
How about you, Jonathan?
I'd probably say my Dungeon of Chance, because I really love the mechanic of kind of like a gotcha game kind of probabilities, and I liked the kobolds probably in there.
Yeah.
For me, I definitely go with Zarya from the Dungeon That Walks Like a Man, because mobility would be nice, being able to walk around, and her mobs are all just mimics that from various things that she's animated. So sky's the limit, but I'd probably try and start off with something basic, like that hides really well in a walking house, as best as you can hide in a walking house.
Jeffrey?
The Hungry Dungeon, the one I'm coming out with. And that's because it's literally a dungeon where adventurers do not die. Rather, they go down into the dungeon to hunt their own food. And when they come back up to the tavern level, that food is cooked and served to them. And you go into the hungry dungeon, you pick out your meal for the day if you don't want the free meal, and then you go hunt your ingredients.
Nice.
I want to read
So
that when it comes out.
yes, that's
I will as well.
and I'm including real world recipes just with a fantasy twist on them as well. So, like, I don't think anybody's going to find a spiked rabbit to cook.
So I had a couple of little questions here that people were asking. Well, it looks like some of it has been answered here, but so which series is it, Alex, that has the walking dungeon?
So that is Yagakor, the dungeon that walks like a man. It's currently on Royal Road. It had to go on hiatus for a few months. I dealt with another obligation, writing wise, and some health issues, but I'm actually going to resume posting on it tomorrow. So that'll be resuming quickly, and I hope to have it out by the end of the month.
Nice.
Excellent. So another question came in. How do you stop the dungeon from breaking the local and world economy?
Ooh, I was very proud of how I solved this one because, so Dinosaur Dungeon, when I was doing that, one of the world building details I include in that one is true for all my novels because they share a universe. Gathering too much gold, silver, or copper, or any precious metal in one place will spawn a dragon. So they can't break the economy because if they do, you're going to have a dragon problem, which is what the book became about.
Funny you should mention that. That's going to be a problem with the dungeon economics book. But in my case, how do you stop the dungeon from breaking the local world economy? That's one of the pacing issues that I was alluding to earlier. Not only a dungeon can get really strong, or a dungeon can. It's almost in a sense when you're writing Dungeon Core, it's almost like you're doing a dungeon simulation video game. Shout out to Jonathan Brooks for having that published with the Crafters. Um, but you have to balance wealth and a lot of vibrations. Wealth and danger, and then also power. So that's the main reason why at the end of my original Quadrilogy series that I had the dungeon shift due to book events to a different location to sort of start over, but not completely start over. And then for Bio Dungeon with Jonathan, it was we really just were sort of aiming for a final result in mind, essentially. We didn't go past that, and we didn't stop before that point. But really, Dungeon Core, I think, as a whole, either has to end within like a trilogy or 4 to 5 books because of the pacing issues, or that you have to in some way be able to change location for a fresh story.
I think a lot of it does depend on how you've structured your story. I mean, I usually outline everything before I get started, so I kind of know where the dungeon's going to start, where it's going to end, and you can kind of structure the economy so it doesn't go too haywire. Usually, dungeon starts in a out of the way place because it's new, it's weak, and it doesn't attract a whole lot at first, but then it gets going. But at some point, you end the story before you get too much insanity. I wish I would have thought of the idea of the treasure and the dragons, though. That's great.
Thank you.
There's a different mechanics that you can kind of put in place. Some of the books and series I wrote, the economy kind of was broken in certain areas. But things like Dungeon of Chance, I made it so that items were bind on pickup, so they could only possess them. They couldn't trade them. Other ones where they would get punished if they, like in Dungeon Fairy, they would get punished and possibly destroyed if they started going crazy, giving out too many rewards. But there's other ones where, like in my dungeon crafting series, my core was quite powerful and could make just about anything. And it kind of broke the economy in that section of the world. But the problem was there were so many dungeons around that it didn't really matter. It really just let them survive rather than, dominating the world economy. And there's little mechanics like that, like with the dragon, that you can do to limit the breaking. But there's going to be some you can have fun with, but overall, there's some things that you can do.
Another quick question here. How do you find the balance between dungeon building and character story progression?
Honestly, that part isn't too terribly difficult in that specific question scenario, I think. Just because the dungeon develops with itself, right? The weak dungeon has to learn what it means to be weak and how to get stronger, and then it grows and develops learning the lessons of progression, you could call it, especially if there are adventurers or some human intervention involved that could either greatly benefit or greatly harm the dungeon. Uh, the pacing issues that come from this generally are involved with if you didn't set up your strength economy very well. So now you're too strong too quickly and you're OP and it's boring, or you don't get strong enough and the story is too slow and the readers are just bored with it.
And that's definitely, I agree with that. Also, for me, I have a rule when it comes to writing where every chapter needs to advance either character growth or the story in some way. And I found it's really easy to introduce that into the dungeon building sections. Like the dungeon while building isn't just going to sit there and go through, bit by bit what they're doing to the dungeon. They're going to be talking to their wisp or fairy. They're going to be thinking about what's happened, and they'll usually have like a revelation, or they will plan something that will reveal to the reader part of what they've learned or part of how they've grown as a character, because they're thinking of making the dungeon, say, more or less lethal in response to attacks that have happened. So it's kind of, I feel like you can show that in the dungeon building, and that's kind of the best way to balance it, so that way it's not like it pauses the narrative for that to happen.
I like to challenge the dungeon by throwing in some stronger adventurer parties or whatever, and that way I can kind of progress. Like they failed, so what do they need to do to progress and get better? That's kind of some of the things that I do to kind of balance those two, just to kind of move it along.
Another question came in. So, what made you start mixing dungeon core with sci-fi tropes?
Okay, Dean,
This is
start
this is
one.
Dean's wheelhouse
Yes,
right here.
this is Dean.
I'll answer it after you.
Yeah, at the time it was, most of the dungeon core novels were kind of followed more of a fantasy format, and I really love science fiction, so I wanted to find a way, how do we make a dungeon in a science fiction setting? And I thought, what better than a starship, or what was the remains of a destroyed starship is where it starts out at. And I just really wanted to start those elements, and so I just came up with an idea and a concept of how this dungeon exists and how it came to be and how that fits in the rest of the universe with other ones floating around out there. So yeah, it's something I'm going to jump back into. The 3-book series is complete, but I've got more in that universe that's going to be coming before too long.
So for me, my most recent book was a sci-fi lit RPG dungeon core, corporate sci-fi lit RPG dungeon core. And honestly, ever since Derelict first came out, I've also wanted to write a sci-fi, but I've honestly been too nervous to do it because I was worried that I wasn't familiar enough with the tropes for a sci-fi, or essentially just messing it up, honestly. It's one of the reasons I sought out Steven, who has done a lot of more sci-fi stuff, and for his help in making sure that things sort of made sense within that genre. And then I could just roll with the whole corporate space station aspect of uh, like GLaDOS mixed with Michael Duncan from The Office, as I like to call the personality there. So it's like what we said at the beginning of this panel, that you could take Dungeon Core anywhere, and that in these few years since it's existed and we've all written in it, we've just been pioneering new ground to write stuff in. And it's the wide open space is just the perfect place for a dungeon to be with the endless growth potential.
Alex, I know you've done some sci-fi with the Coreverse. How did that come about for you?
So for me, I've always loved science fantasy. In fact, like I cannot tell you how excited I was when Dungeons and Dragons announced they're bringing Spelljammer back. Like that was my thing. So the Corvus, I'm keeping it more fantasy oriented, but the space stuff will be coming in the future, and I just like that particular blend. I do have on my potential list, because I have a list of things that are definitely going to happen and things that I want to maybe do if time permits. One of them is Void Dungeon, which is a space dungeon, but mine would probably be much more fantasy than sci-fi.
Huh.
Yep.
So looks like we're having a little bit of technical issues, but we'll keep soldiering on here if the recording's still going on. So the what I'd like to get into is for authors that are considering jumping into the Dungeon Core genre. What advice would you have for a new author that maybe isn't published or is in some other genre to jump into it? Jonathan, you want to give it a go?
Yeah, I'd say biggest thing is read. Read as many of the Dungeon Core books out there as possible. Get a good understanding of not just what has been done, but also the tropes, the different ways you can kind of go about doing Dungeon Core. And then once they actually start to write, probably plan it out as much as possible beforehand. If you have a lot of mechanics to it, decide on all those things first. That's actually the first thing that I do. Is when I usually have a new story I want to write, I usually base it on some mechanics I want to mess with. So like time loops or the probabilities, that kind of stuff. I kind of build it from there. That's just me, but that's what I would do before you actually get started. Is decide all those things first before you actually start writing.
Alex?
So my biggest piece of advice would be read other books, read other Dungeon Core books, and decide what does and doesn't, what are things you do and don't want to incorporate. Because having that familiarity with the genre will be important. As I've seen people, come into genres without really knowing it, thinking they understand, thinking they can do it, and it usually doesn't go great. So make sure you've read some, but don't feel like anything that you've read should be your Bible for this book either. Like, it's a new genre. There's a lot of room to shake it up. As long as you, in some way, have a stationary place that has something happening in it, and the stationary place has some measure of control over its interior, that's really all you need. Like, it's that flexible. And so just anything in that, feel free to borrow ideas from others, but don't feel like you are bound to them either.
I would say one, you should definitely buy all of her books, like we've been saying. Two, if you want some free editing and help, the Dungeon Anthology is a great place, right, to get some free editing and feedback. And I say that as a plug, but I'm not earning any money from that, so it's not much of a plug, honestly. Um, so I would definitely say, what idea do you want to write about, right? Because if you're writing a dungeon, then you're writing it in some fantastical world, whether it's actual fantasy or sci-fi or the real world or apocalypse or something. And what do you want to end up with as your final product? Like, where do you want the story to start? Where do you want it to end? And then sort of build your little stopping points within the book, and then come up with system ideas to help connect those gaps. Sort of, instead of the anthology, um, the common saying I hear when you're writing is meat on the bones. You know, when it comes to detail and story. But when you're writing Dungeon Core, it's almost, instead of a human you're building in a weird, phrasing sense, you're almost building a house, I would say, and not a house to for you to live, but a house where you can just poke your eye out one of those windows and watch all the people go by and wonder if they're going to break into your house.
I think also, I'll kind of piggyback on the fact that you need to read everything in the genre first. But once you've done that, you need to have a passion for it. If you read these Dungeon Core books and you're just kind of like, yeah, okay, they're fine, and don't waste your time. If it's kind of strikes a chord with you and you're like, wow, I really like this, I want to dig into it, it's meaty, I want some extra, I want to put my own spin on it, then jump in and start writing. Plan a lot first, because it is very detail oriented, and the dungeon will get away from you if you let it. But definitely don't jump in unless you have a passion for it and you really enjoy reading in the subgenre first.
Absolutely agreed. I just want to quickly share something that I just found funny. You mentioned the dungeon get away from you. So I was not keeping great track when I was doing the first draft of Dinosaur Dungeon, which resulted in me at one point sitting there talking to my editors, my beta readers, going, I lost track of the raptors. I was too high on Jurassic Park. Raptors are hard to keep track of.
Clever girl.
Exactly.
So, what's the on that same note with writing? What do you find the most challenging in this genre, in just writing in general in this genre? What's the biggest challenge for you in it?
So, for me, one of the biggest things, LitRPG, so normal novel, you have your characters and you have your plot and you have your themes, right? And then in a fantasy novel, you have the world building and all that goes into it. Then LitRPG, you also have the system stuff on top of that. And then in Dungeon Core, you also add to that the interior of the dungeon, everything that goes with that. It's like a world inside a world. So there's just so many nested layers of things to keep track of. And doing that is one of the hardest things for this particular genre, I think. It's making sure that you're, like Dean said, keeping track of all the moving pieces, keeping track of everything that's going on in the book, and still telling a cohesive story while you're doing so, and not, spending too much time on one thing so the other things suffer.
I think the hardest part for me writing is regulating danger. So danger to like the dungeon core, and making sure there's an appropriate amount. Because if you have a dungeon core that can never be destroyed, then there's no point in having defenses. So regulating the danger while still making it entertaining and not making them too OP, so that it's an entertaining story.
I think for me, there's a challenge of getting too lost in the details. You get into writing. I don't know if you guys have the same thing, but I have all the spreadsheets, all the character lists, everything else. I think for Cat Core, I had 12 pages of cats and all their descriptions I had to keep referencing. But just to not get caught up in the details and then look back and go, you know what? I forgot about the story. Let's get back to that part.
So I'm in an interesting situation, and it's kind of reflective in my writing. But the uh, the original Slime Dungeon book was written in NaNoWriMo, so it was written in a month with no reference. It was all off the top of my head, and the subsequent books were sort of feeding off of that. But I started out as what I call an inspired kind of a writer, as opposed to a planning kind of a writer. So I wrote a chapter, and then whatever came out of my fingers was, the push for the direction of the story. So I did minimum planning, and that's kind of reflective in some of the weird stuff that happens. Some of it for good, some of it in bad in the original four, I'd say. And as a result, I really am not a fan of my original four compared to my more recent books, which I have done planning with. When Jonathan and I were doing bio, we had a Google Doc. We broke down, location, things to happen, general plot ideas, and there was still some stuff that while writing the book we ended up changing. Um, it was still a planned story with mechanics. Well, I actually don't know all the math you did, Jonathan, for the for all the stem cells and all that stuff, but it's clear that you had a system for that.
Mm-hmm.
And
I did.
similarly for Station Core, once again, it was a huge breakdown of the outline, what's going to happen, and then filling in the gaps. So it's something that I'm becoming better at, but it's not still not something I'm perfect with. But the having a good editor though is definitely a plus. Ellen, when I first hired her to edit for me, she asked me so many questions about how things worked and how things were supposed to be. I ended up making an entire book I published that was literally just the general rules and history and everything else of the world that is the basis for the Slimeverse. So now if I have something, I just refer back to that.
On a note around that, not editors, but the collaboration portion. Um, can you discuss collaborations? There's already been some collaboration within this group, but maybe just a general discussion on the challenges and benefits of collaboration in Dungeon Core.
I want to let Jonathan talk because I want to hear his perspective.
Well, I think that like the benefits of having collaboration is having a lot more ideas that you wouldn't necessarily think of. I would have never thought because he came up with the original idea for the bio dungeon for a dungeon inside the body using cells and stuff, and I would have never thought of that. And we kind of worked back and forth to kind of put the story together and all the elements. And I think when you collaborate with someone, you really get to expand what you are capable of. And there's always challenges because it's something that you can't control yourself completely, so that you're writing it with somebody else. But those are things that you can figure out and work out, and it's all the better for it.
So my experience with collaboration was different than both of you because the people I have who are also writing books in the Coreverse, it's a very different dynamic. Like, I give them the document that has the basic overall world building for the universe. Like, these are the things that must be true across all worlds. These are the things that you can change as much as you want. What you got? What do you have for me? And then once they pitch it, we talk about it. We go over the world building and the characters, and then we talk about how it's going to incorporate into the crossover afterwards. And then it's basically I just sit back and read over it when they're done. It's much more free form as than because I'm not directly working on it while they're writing. I'm more just providing the Bible and then some feedback and answering questions when needed.
For me, it's something I haven't done yet. I haven't done any collaboration with any other authors, so it's something that interests me. It just would have to be the right project and someone that you enjoy working with.
Well,
I'll
let's
talk
hook
to you
that up right
later.
now, right here.
I'll talk to you later, Dean. I already got
Right,
something for January, though.
we're around.
I think a 4-author collaboration going on right now. We can start workshopping it right here. Uh, so
Geneva.
this was a question from earlier, specifically for Dean. How did Catcore come about?
It's one of those where you just kind of ask yourself, what if? And I think you look at all these cores, and a lot of times we try to pick someone that becomes the core. Usually it's a person that dies and becomes a core or something of that nature. And it's always someone that's fits that world. They're military, they're a gamer, there's something that gives them an advantage there. So what if you take the most unlikely person to become a dungeon core that has no skills and drop them in the mix? What happens? And who's the most unlikely person? Elderly cat lady that's never even heard of a video game before. And so you drop her in there, and someone that's just very formidable. She doesn't take any guff from anyone and just is who she is, and watch the chaos ensue.
I have to say, going through the list of books and reading Derelict, and then suddenly your author page pops up, and I see Catcore. All right, well, let's jump into that. That's a stark difference, but that's awesome. So we have about 10 minutes or so left. What I'd like to do is give you all some platform. What's coming next? What do you have in the pipeline? When's it coming out? And we'll go from there. So, Jonathan, what's new? What's coming?
Well, I am currently finishing up Caverns of Fear, which is the 5th and final book in my Spirit Core series. That is a series that's about a serial killer who is basically a ghost core and is tasked to kill people using their fear. So that'll be coming out just before Halloween, and then I'll be doing Dimensional Dungeon Cores Book 4, and then for December, and then Time Core Book 3 for January.
Awesome. Alex?
So next up for me is finishing up Yaga Core. There's It Looks Like a Man. It's a bit of a mouthful. Let's call it Yaga Core. Finishing up Yaga Core and publishing that. After that comes The Warden's War, which is the crossover between Factory of the Gods, Dragon Scion, Yaga Core, Roots and Steel, Dinosaur Dungeon, and I think a couple other are going to be in there too, depending on when they get finished. And that's going to be my next massive project. I'm hoping to get Yaga Core out this month, or November or early December, and then Warden's War out. I went out by March at the latest, and then from there, I'm going to be looking at doing a dungeon core that takes place during a LitRPG Apocalypse event, and we'll see how that goes after that. So that's kind of my upcoming plans.
Awesome, Jeffrey.
So I am trying to get Hungry Dungeon and Dungeon Economics out right now. Hungry Dungeon, I've got my first draft done. We'll see how that goes. And Dungeon Economics, I've got the first 3.5 chapters written. So I'm going to try to get that out next month if I can. Then a possible new dungeon collab for January. We'll have to see how that goes, if scheduling can work out. And beyond that, the rewrites for the original Slime Dungeons with my new cover arts, which I will share on the screen if that's appropriate. Question mark?
I don't know if you can.
Let's see. I think I can. Oop, nope, not that one. Sorry to take away from you, Dean.
Oh, no worries.
There we go. Share. So, Slime Dungeon 1, or sorry, Dungeon Wars 1, The Slime Dungeon. And that will hopefully be coming out next year or December if things work out with my scheduling. That's it.
Awesome. That's a lot. Dean.
Yeah, I've got the third book in my War Core series coming out next month. So you'll get to see mechs in Los Angeles tearing the place up. So that should be a fun one. After that, I'm working on my LitRPG series, Limitless Seas, the next book in that series. But sometime next year in the future, there will be a new Dungeon Core project. Just think of another unusual dungeon, car dealership dungeon.
Nice.
So,
That'll be fun.
Dungeon of Deals.
That's the greatest thing
There we
about
go.
this genre is that if you can think of it, you can search for it and find it. You know, if I want a slice of life farming dungeon, I'm sure it's out there somewhere. And if not, it will be in a month. That's awesome. I appreciate the genre for just filling every niche that I could possibly ever want to read. But I want to thank you all. Thanks for sticking with us through all the technical difficulties and all of that. It was an honor to mod this panel for y'all. I love all your books. So now we must do some awkward hand waves, dance party, whatever you'd like. So jazz hands, whatever you got.
Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle.